I'm Alan Walker, host of the Twin Cities Creation Science Association podcast. I'm on the board of TCCSA, and I want to thank Dr. Ross Olson for setting up the podcast, and also for Ryan Pickett for editing and posting on YouTube and Rumble. Our guest is Dr. Glen Collins, who has a bachelor's and a master's in electrical engineering from Georgia Tech and a PhD in artificial intelligence from Vanderbilt University. Also a certificate in acoustical engineering, and he is a registered professional engineer in the United States and a chartered engineer in Ireland. Dr. Collins used to work in the satellite communications industry and is now retired. Dr. Collins presented Physics Today in What's Still the Matter to the Twin Cities Creation Science Association on June 20th, 2023. He updated us on what is happening in physics as interpreted by scientists from common sense science. His presentation reviewed and updated the work by common sense scientists Bill Lucas and David Bergman that discussed important aspects of the universal force, atomic and subatomic models, and much more. Dr. Collins explained in layman's terms some very technical research. That presentation is now on TCCSA's YouTube and Rumble. So we're going to continue this when I ask Dr. Collins some questions, and he will provide us with those answers. Our first question, Dr. Collins, is how did physics get off track over the decades?
Well, thank you for the invitation to speak. Regarding that particular question, there are actually many perspectives. I'm going to propose three perspectives as to what happened. The first perspective is based on a change in the scientific method. Back in the 1800s, scientists were making efforts to keep mathematics and things streamlined, and they made some assumptions, such as a point particle assumption, that later turned out to be incorrect in our perspective. For example, Maxwell did this in his derivation of electromagnetic equations, and Heaviside did the same with the vector potential. And quantum theory went on with the point particle assumption and the concept of an ether and so forth. So the other thing that happened was a deliberate change in the scientific method from the axiomatic and empirical methods used by people like Newton to the existentialist philosophy, where the only things that really mattered were appearances. So this changed the views at the time. So later, when these equations with these simplifications began giving wrong answers, such as for the photoelectric effect and high-speed phenomena, the equations weren't abandoned, but the underlying principles were abandoned and presumed as wrong. And Einstein came along as one of the first to fill the gap with his special relativity theory, and then others came along with interpretation of quantum effects. And as a result, in our view, all of the force laws that they're currently using are incorrect. Now, that's kind of the change in scientific method view. There's another view, kind of called the philosophic view, and there's a German physicist, Sabine Hoffenfelder, and she wrote a book called Lost in Math, and she claims what happened is that physicists were enamored with elegant theories, elegant mathematics, and that this took them astray. And then finally, there's the Christian perspective on this. Many Christians are perhaps naive about other belief systems, and they fail to understand the extent to which non-Christians are vehemently opposed to what Christians believe, and the lengths to which they'll go to cut God out of everything at every turn. The world system cannot and will not acknowledge the Creator, and they must interpret the world and the cosmos and physics as a result in a materialistic, godless, and mechanistic manner. You can look at the history of science and see where, when the opportunity was there to do so, secular views were inserted or selected. So these are multiple reasons as to how physics got off the track and led us to where we are today.
Well, thank you, Dr. Collins, for your answer. My next question is, can you explain common sense science?
Common sense science is basically a body of scientific theory that regards matter and forces and describes the physical world, building on classical laws, geometric models, absolute time, and what's called Galilean, or what we would think of as normal space. Our goal has been to correct perceived deficiencies in modern physics by reapplying sound scientific methods to develop better theories and physical models. From common sense science's point of view, physics and the real world that physics purports to represent can be described using fully physical structured models and not just abstractions or mathematical constructs. We use mathematics, but we don't claim that the mathematics is the reality. It represents the reality. So our foundational principles are based on the law of cause and effect and the assertion that the universe and natural phenomenon are fundamentally electrical in character. And we've used these principles to derive a universal force law and physical models for particles. And these models and these force laws apply at all scales from the subatomic to the cosmos level.
Thank you. Let's dig a little bit deeper. Why does the larger physics community and even the creation community not see the sense of common sense science?
Well, that's an interesting question to answer because it requires perhaps one to speculate a little bit. But let's start with physics 100 years ago was quite different. There was a significant open argument. Everybody got published. Everyone read everyone else's papers. But today, we live in a world where there are peer review committees and gatekeepers for what is determined to be correct orthodoxy by those who have the positional power or the popularity to say what is correct. This concept of orthodoxy or consensus idea in science creates an inertia that makes it even more difficult for alternative ideas to get considered. For example, today there are hundreds of alternative physics theories with thousands of papers published every month. Additionally, people tend to follow the leader, so to speak, and stick with the appearance of consensus and official pronouncements, even though it's difficult as a result to get visibility for any alternative theory. And this is particularly true if your alternative theories or thoughts have a Christian or otherwise biblical philosophy as its foundational principles. Keep in mind as well, physics in general is a detailed and heavily mathematical collection of things for which not everyone's ready or willing to delve into it. And as a result, you have a smaller audience looking at this kind of material to begin with. As to the creation community's perspective, I think it's important to realize that common sense science work is based on the work of Dr. Thomas Barnes. He was a PhD in physics and one of the early presidents of the Creation Research Society. He was one of the founders of the Institute for Creation Research, along with Henry Morris. He was the first dean of Christian Heritage College, which is associated with the ICR. And he founded the ideas and supported the work that is promoted by common sense science. Now, since Dr. Barnes' passing, physics conversation among the creation community kind of went adrift or was quiet for a while until another physicist sort of de facto became the person whose views of relativity theories and was an adherent to at least what's called causal quantum mechanics, kind of took over the position of vetting what is put in creation scientific publications. This particular physicist tends to function, I guess, as a gatekeeper for what's published. And in his view, the common sense science is just one of hundreds of theories that are out there vying for his attention. Whatever he has read or seen of common sense science theories has led him to see it as incomplete, not fully comprehensive, or not credible. So there's no motivation for him to consider an alternative physics approach, since his views on causal quantum mechanics and relativity theories seem to work fine. So there's no motivation. So we publish in other venues and present information as we're able, and that's sort of why things are the way they are.
Well, thank you, Dr. Collins, for being a current voice for common sense science. My next question is the Copenhagen interpretation a reason for physics to go back and check your work?
Actually, some of those who contributed to the Copenhagen interpretation, or at least their work did, long ago gave reasons to question the Copenhagen interpretation and check the work. For example, Louis de Broglie and David Bohm had different interpretations, which today has become what's called the causal quantum mechanics, or de Broglie-Bohmian mechanics. Dr. Lucas, who's one of the common sense scientists, wrote a letter to the editor of the Journal of Creation regarding quantum mechanics back in 2011. The journal chose not to publish his letter. But in that letter, he took a position not only against the Copenhagen interpretation, but in opposition to quantum mechanics more broadly as it's currently taught. That interpretation is based on existential philosophy, which bases its view of the physical world on idealizations and appearances rather than physical reality. In fact, the appearances are the reality from that particular perspective. It's based on, for example, idealized point particles and oscillators governed by random statistical processes and idealizations, which have become their physical reality. Now, there are alternative views exist, that hold that quantum mechanics can have finite-sized particles. And this one that I mentioned, the Bohmian or causal quantum mechanics, many people in the creationist community like it. And it eliminates at least the measurement or observer problem in quantum mechanics, the Copenhagen interpretation. So the short answer is many people from the beginning of the Copenhagen interpretation have questioned it and think they need to go back and check their homework. From our perspective at Common Sense Science, none of the prevailing quantum mechanic theories have a correct model of particles, which would have their electric and magnetic fields attached to them and moving with the particle. And neither are they using corrected or valid electrodynamics or force equations.
Thank you. You mentioned a particle. Is it logical to consider light to be both a wave and a particle?
It's only logical if your model of physical reality is itself an abstraction based on mathematical equations. This is a continuation of the existential philosophy where appearances are the reality. So when your model or your view of reality abandons physical or physicality, then you can have contradictions being believed simultaneously. In fact, they have to be if that's the model that you're going to choose. But if your model of particles includes electric and magnetic fields that are attached to and move with the particles, then things like the double slit experiment, other quantum effects and phenomenon can be physically explained and understood while you still have particles as particles and waves as waves. So
thank you. What about the proofs of relativity? Can you comment on that?
Well, let's talk about that word proof, shall we?
Okay.
No scientist should ever use the word proof because nothing in science is ever proven. Instead, you find evidence that is, or observations that are consistent with your theory, or they're inconsistent with your theory. It's the press, the media, that love to use the word proof. And some scientists out there will tend to use it in a casual sense. But evidence and observations can either fit and support your theory and be consistent with it, or They don't. And notice that evidence and observations can fit or support more than one theory at a time, and they usually do. So many experimental results that are consistent with special relativity theory, general relativity theory, they fit all of the common sense science theories, for example. So multiple theories can explain the evidence or the so-called proofs, but relativity hasn't been proven any more than our theories have been proven. It's whether or not the evidence supports it. And then, of course, every time you find evidence that goes against your theory, you either question the theory or you find a way to wallpaper over it, or you say the evidence is not important, or you question how the experiment was done. And these techniques have been used for decades. So many people have written about this, and to really examine so-called proofs or disproofs, I would defer to and refer people to work by a scientist named Kurt Renshaw, where he studied, and a group of scientists studied, all of the things that are supposedly proofs of relativity, such as the Fizeau, Fresnel, Michelson-Morley, Sagnac, all these experiments and all this data. And he studied every one of these experiments over a 100-year period beginning in 1818. And in his paper, which was published in Galilean Electrodynamics in 1996, he demonstrates that there were base assumption errors that resulted in errors of interpretation for each of these experiments, and then they compounded one another, such that it was a series of bad assumptions and faulty interpretations that led Einstein to develop special relativity theory, which Renshaw shows is not even needed, as does Dr. Bill Lucas with common sense science. You don't need special relativity theory. You can use an etherless Galilean space, and you can come up with the exact same mathematical results without having to have length contraction or time dilation or Fresnel's ether drag coefficient. You don't need those things. So proofs of relativity, there's evidence that supports it, but that same evidence supports other better theories, in our opinion.
Thank you. For our listeners, why should we as believers or followers in Jesus Christ care about this topic?
That's a good question. I like that question a lot. Physical reality, or what humans think physical reality is, affects people's worldview and how they think about their world. And that includes their view of Scripture and whether or not there's a creator and that kind of thing. Current secular physics belief system is based on concepts that physical reality is based on probabilities. It's fundamentally random without actual cause and effect. Physics and ethics are both relative, and there's only really an elite intellectual few that can understand physics correctly. And that doesn't include you and me, of course. These concepts are not just inconsistent with scriptural principles, they're actually in active opposition to scriptural principles, and have created over time an illusion that science, particularly physics, is at odds with Scripture and Scripture's teachings about the nature, reality, the physical world, and real history. So secularists and Christian scientists who try to explicitly separate moral and ethical beliefs from science and physics do this in vain, because the writers of philosophy and religion expressly base their views on widely held physics beliefs. So it's important to realize that physics is the foundational science. It underlies all other sciences. It ultimately underlies what all other philosophies consider the real world is like, and how it really works and what it's made of. And as Ken Ham said in his book, The Lie, if you destroy the foundations of anything, the structure will collapse. So this is why we care at Common Sense Science. We're attempting to establish scripturally consistent foundations in physics, which is the foundational science.
It's a great answer. I appreciate that. Are there any other issues that you would like to share?
Well, there's lots of issues out there, Alan. I don't know that the main thing I'd like to do is thank the Twin Cities Creation Science Association for inviting me to speak and present the work of Common Sense Science. People can get in touch with us at or see the work at commonsensescience.net on the internet. And they can certainly contact me, Glen, Glen .Collins at transtechnology.net. That's TRANS technology at .net. But in any case, thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Well, you're welcome. And let me end this podcast with a few of my own comments. Jesus Christ created all things, including the laws of nature and physical constants. His design and creation is verified in the subjects of mathematics, physics, chemistry, geology, biology, cosmology, music, art, and language. Jesus Christ designed the integral part of the mathematics on which the universe is structured and functions when he created the universe. Mathematics and physics are the language of the created world. Thank you for being so transparent and giving out your address there, Dr. Collins, and God bless you. And thank you very much for being our guest.
Thank you. Appreciate the invite.